Last time!
We're all gonna die, starting with Griff!
Sidebar, what is it with games I reviewed as of late where the evil end boss, whose will is carried out by the proxy possessing a humanoid vessel, then creates around its host a giant freaking egg to birth its true form? It's been happening more frequently than I've liked. Sophie was critically wounded from that attack, not even Cheria's healing abilities seeming to do anything to help her at all, as parts of her body are just plain shutting down, starting with it leaving her blind. And with Lambda calling Sophie Proto-Haste in the prior scene, and all the prior Amartian data on it that goes back centuries, Pascal connects the dots to Sophie being entirely inhuman, the Guardian against Lambda doing this exact thing, as they've also realized outright it's Lambda that's controlling Richard. And the most likely way to find help for her and to determine another way to stop Lambda is to travel to where she likely originated, Fodra, which they don't know where that is. Fortunately, the overseer of the Amartians meets with us, revealing that the Amartian Enclave previously also kept an archive in Strata that has even older information than the one they have in Fendel, as their people have had to emigrate across the continents during various points in their history. Considering the legendary creature nature of their legends, it wouldn't surprise me to learn that their people were hunted down like witches as the peoples of Athenia lost the knowledge they once possessed. So those who stayed engineers in periods like the Dark Age would appear to possess heretical powers. It explained why Windor and Strata are all but absent their presence, despite evidence they once resided there. And yeah, that archive is in Sable Izol, the Stratan city of scholars, which we're allowed to fast travel back to thanks to the Overseer's intervention. Sophie coming with despite her weakening condition, as this is to be how she ultimately dies. She doesn't want to be far from Ospel's arms. We reach Sable Izol without much fanfare. President Dillon meeting us and getting an update on everything happening. Him letting us into the sealed archive, whose defenses are then disabled by Pascal's presence. The search of the archive, revealing Fodra's true location. I mean, it's not like Pascal can pull an interplanetary spaceship out of her scarf. The archives actually do show the location of one left over from the emigration from Fodra, but the issue is the aquasphere over the planet, as, yeah, space travel and travel through a layer of dense, pressurized water, that's a very different matter. When I first played this, the idea of the aquasphere just annoyed me, due to how planetary atmospheres work. As the farther you travel up from the surface, the less dense anything up there gets due to a combination of being farther from a source of gravity and a lack of communal pressure from other molecules being present due to the vacuum of space. In essence, liquid water cannot exist in a vacuum, as to exist in a liquid form requires some form of pressure to be exerted upon those molecules. Though in the absence of pressure, water actually turns to ice crystals, so it wouldn't even be water vapor up there either, just ice chunks. And worse, dense water actually refracts light. So for everything on the surface of a world that has a dense layer of water surrounding the planet like this, it caused them to lose something required for them to live. I held this opinion until we got our first proper look at the planets in artwork, where what I thought was a technological ring circling the planet seemed to actually be holding that shell of water up from the surface to suspend it up. I eventually got pointed in the right direction of one of the Tales wikis that had translated an Apocrypha book for the game, and it turned out the aquasphere actually isn't made up of water at all, but nanoparticles meant to keep the atmosphere of the planet contained inside it, which is part of the closed system of the world created by the outer mechanical ring that sustains the world's entire life support system. So I have less problem with it now than I did before. I just wish it had been discussed in the game, as I feel that kind of oddity needed more explaining. Maybe it was that I missed that section, but you've all heard my complaints already with the game seeming to just stop just that one step from connecting properly all of its narrative dots. There's a plan in place for that too. Apparently there's also a pair of old installations that fire a heat ray that momentarily opens a path through the aquasphere. But then the shuttle haven't been used in so long that it's likely they're all run down. The shuttle is found in the seaside cavern right next to Lant, while both heat rays are in sections we've not yet explored of both Strata and Fendel. But it's not like things would be allowed to be that easy. Lambda's egg is also spawning minion beasts that are spreading out across the planet. Fleets from the nations meant to secure the World's Eye already being demolished, and it's only a matter of time before the main continents themselves are assaulted. We find the shuttle pretty quickly, all things considered, once we're back in launch, Pascal confirming that they can control the firing system of the heat ray from the launch site as well. It's just getting both operational again, that's the holdup. As is Lambda's monsters flying by them, on course for the launch settlement. Oh great, so how are the citizens going to be ungrateful for Aspel showing up to help them this time? At this point, Strata has entirely abandoned launch as well, showing how their allies in this were only fair-weather friends. Bailey, the guy who blamed Aspel for everything earlier, entirely failing at their defense. Until in comes the guy they guilted into the job as Lord and then tossed out on his ass, coming to save them again. Though, 6 more people, one of them being injured, yeah, that's not going to turn the tide. However, because these monsters are born of Lambda's power, Sophie's own abilities can counter them, exploding out from her, but doing so has only further damaged her body.
アスベル様、俺は長いことあなたを誤解していたような気がします。
Too little, too late. But then again, I'm not as forgiving as Aspel, and I know the full story about how much of a jackass Aston was. Yeah, and then he decided he was right and didn't need to at all consult the people whose lives he was negatively affecting.
Am I so out of touch? No, it's the children who are wrong.
We're back to Fendel next to find the malfunctioning cannon, Sophie collapsing completely as they attempt to travel when she loses all motor functions, meaning she doesn't have much time left. The installation here doesn't have much wrong with it, the dungeon's puzzles being you just need to reroute power through it using electrical way stations in order to restore power to the heat cannon. But unfortunately that leads to the other snag if someone needs to be at the controls to actually launch the shuttle. And Fourier is being an immature brat, despite being older than Pascal, about her own incompetence, bruised ego, and the fact that her work got a man killed. Well, okay, it's not actually because of that last one, but it's still among the things she should feel guilt over. Instead, Poisson has to do it, meaning Pascal has to spend time teaching her what to do to launch them, which wastes their dwindling precious time. But as more of Lambda's monsters attack them, Fourier comes in to show that she's not that self-absorbed, and saves them by having monsters she bred in her lab cover them as the shuttle launches, on a direct collision course for Fodra. And I mean that literally, they immediately crash the ship. Fortunately, they're not far from what looks to be a floating city in the sky that was likely their intended destination, so they at least have an idea towards their path of travel instead of looking around blind. But this does not help that Fodra is completely, well, a dead world. Nothing's shown to grow here, and the only things that's left being monsters that... I can't even imagine how these things would survive here when the entire planet is desolate. Like, even for things that live in deserts, those creatures have attuned themselves for survival in that environment and conserve their energy and food that they can gather. But short of the monsters eating each other endlessly, that should really only result in diminishing returns. As carnivores eat herbivores and other carnivores, but the herbivores die out if there is no plant life. And if there is no herbivores, then carnivores can only eat themselves until there's nothing left to eat, and they die out too. The best I could guess is these monsters might survive off of Eleth energy the planet may release, but that's hard to buy too as there's nothing ambiently around to validate that, and it's later said that Fodra's core had gone dormant for a time, so what the actual hell? Regardless, we find a teleporter pad into the city, just as Sophie falls catatonic. But inside we find one of the android caretakers still functioning, who in turn leads us to a capsule, which contains a woman named Emeraude, or rather, an android with her consciousness stored within it. And this woman? She is the entire reason why Fodra is a dead world. I am skipping ahead to explain all this once more, but Fodra as a planet in millennia past was similar to Aphinia, and that its core was not made up of hyper-pressurized metals and magma spinning to create a magnetic field that allowed life to develop, but instead had its own Lastalia, a core of Eleth energy that naturally flowed around the planet. Emeraude was a researcher of the Lastalia, and created multiple ways to exploit its power and resources. And the Lastalia itself proved to be sentient to an extent. This being then created Lambda as a means of learning about the people who lived upon it, why they were harming it by drawing as much power from it as they did, and opening some means of communication between the two so they'd stop abusing it. At the same time as this, an entity likewise formed from the Lastalia, later referred to as the Fodra Queen, and began to spawn monsters on the planet as a deterrent against more of the experiments and abuse of the Lastalia. Speaking of, I am deliberately sidestepping my usual irritation of media that insists that a physical planet is alive and a living organism, as opposed to its biosphere being conflated with an Earth's spirit. The game is working on laws of magic with this, whereas my complaint happens when stories that work off of hard science, or lack any mysticism in their setting, try and say the physical planet is a sentient life form. I mean, it's not like I've got a problem with Mogo or Ego from DC or Marvel. When you have magic in your setting, it's more justifiable than, say, .hack trying to assert that. God, I hate the Mama Conspiracy storyline. While Lambda was taken in and cared for by the scientist Cornell, Emeraude saw Lambda as an abomination that was creating the monsters itself by just existing, despite there being absolutely zero proof of that, and decided that the best way to resolve the situation was to experiment on, torture, and ultimately decide to kill Lambda, and set her own creations, combat androids, to do just that. Instead, however, Cornell was mortally wounded in this attack, and subsequently murdered by Emeraude, his last act to send Lambda to Aphinia in an escape shuttle, as the Lastalia core and the Fodra Queen both felt his anguish, and ramped up the monster spawning and attacks, while the life from the rest of the planet in turn withered as the Lastalia stopped releasing any of the Eleth needed to make its varied regions habitable. Lambda crash-landed on Aphinia, the original android body he had been contained in broken, and when he eventually came across people evacuated from Fodra centuries later, they only saw his true form as just another monster and attacked it, thus making it believe that everything its adopted father told him was a lie, and it began lashing out at everyone and everything that attempted to do it harm. And as Emeraude is a garbage scientist that, once more with the true villains of the game, refused to admit any of this was her fault, she made one last creation before she backed herself up into an android. A combat android specifically designed to counteract and destroy the spiritual energy and existence of entities like Lambda, which she named Proto-Haze. She is Sophie's creator, and everything that has occurred in this game regarding the Lambda side of the plot is all consequences originating from the crimes of the mother. In addition to this, the Lastalia that is in Aphinia, which Lambda is threatening now, yeah, that is in fact the Lastalia born from a fragment taken from Fodra's Lastalia. How they got it, I don't know, and if that Lastalia is itself sentient, I have no idea. It could be a case that the people of Fodra started to see irregularities in the Lastalia and started terraforming Aphinia as an emergency shelter before all this happened, and them taking the shard to become the core of that moon was the step too far. It might have been that the terraforming was unrelated and their decline began with taking the core piece, so everything after would just be a cascading reaction. The game is not specific about those details, and Google Foo failed me this time regarding the timeline of events. The bottom line, however, is that, much like with Ospel, Lambda is an abuse victim that lost everything he had, all because of this one sociopathic witch that single-handedly damned her entire world. Sophie's mere presence triggers Lambda's trauma into making it believe that it needs to keep everything away from itself in order for it to feel safe and secure after its positive experiences with humanity were ruined by Emeraude. And even now on Affinia, with the monsters Lambda has spawned, it's done in that same panic to avoid that pain, and is seeking to strike at the root of it to secure its own safety permanently by absorbing the Lastalia of Affinia and kill everyone that would seek to harm it in a protective action, as it expects them, thanks to Emeraude, to only ever attack it. An experience Richard has likewise had, which has caused their bond to form due to their common empathy over it that was all caused by outside factors they had no control over. And the main cast are completely unaware of it, as they beg the witch that was the root cause of it all to fix Sophie. Now, to the game's credit on this one, we don't have the same type of problem with Emeraude as we did with Aston, where he refuses to frame anything he did as bad. The game does acknowledge her in time as a villainous force in the story, with her putting her own goals over the well-being of others, or resolving the crises she ultimately is the cause of. But the same root problem with Aston is present, as when it presents all of these events about the fall of Fodra, it completely forgets to assign the central blame onto the action she, and she alone specifically performed that set such in motion, bending over backwards to justify her actions despite her culpability upon them, and instead leaving them all on Lambda, who was largely not at fault for Fodra's collapse beyond his experience being witnessed by the entities that are, who made summary judgments because of the actions against it. For someone who claims to be a scientist, her conduct is completely irrational to the point of being ludicrous, as during the segments, the story is actually struggling to not write her as a villain, and it tries to frame her as not being one despite the fact she is the central cause of why everything went to hell. For scientists to act like this, they need tangible evidence and data of the facts, and they're completely absent to even pretend to justify her absolute moral bankruptcy as anything but, especially once you learn all of her reasons for hating Lambda are because Cornell cared for Lambda as if the entity were his own son, despite the artificial body that housed him. Whereas Cornell himself refused Emeraude's own romantic affections due to their significant age difference, which seemed to be the catalyst behind her hatred of Lambda that drove all her other actions, which inevitably damned Fodra. Which is several kinds of mixed metaphor, as in all the flashback scenes, the flesh and blood Emeraude is bound to a wheelchair due to an injury she took because of Cornell, which he feels guilt over, and her affections grew out of his compassion, which she showed to absolutely no one in return, as she just wanted to be lavished in his attention. So, is it the disabled that are evil? Is it scientists? Is it love? Is it women? Or is it those that lack empathy, sympathy, compassion, or morality? 'Cause I gotta admit, this game is all across the freaking board on this, with how inconsistent it is over these matters of culpability, as it refuses to admit that all the problems in the world are the results of our predecessors and the generational trauma they inflict upon us with how irresponsible they are, while expecting their children to shoulder the burden and blame and the responsibility to clean up after them, as if it were their own mess instead. I am not letting Lambda off the hook for the crap it's been doing. It is still wrong and needs to be stopped, but it consequently drops its threat level from unrepentant monster that needs a killing down to abuse victim tortured by step-parent that doesn't know how to come to terms with their own grief after their parental figure's death. Okay, maybe it was a good thing that I left Richard in the Zero costume by accident then. But what makes this worse, and even further parallel the crap with Aston? The revelation of Emeraude's crimes? That's not in the main story. Oh no, the grand majority of it, including her actual motivation, much like the truth of Aston's sins, is all buried in a fucking side quest that occurs far past the point the character should be relevant. If you don't do those side quests, the game deliberately makes you think her actions are for the benefit of others, as is a scientist's duty, and the game tries to frame it as her taking such too far. instead of the reality that she is just such an arrogant, selfish, and self-righteous witch that she got fucking friend-zoned. But again, we're not quite there yet, and the crew we've been following are completely unaware of Emeraude's sociopathic malice. Even though her calling Sophie a malfunctioning it should have really been a tip-off for them. Especially since she is herself a biological android the same as Sophie at this point, and thus has no ground to say that Sophie has less cause to be called a human than herself. Regardless, she does know of a facility that can repair Sophie's internal systems to get her back online. The complex is a complete maze, however, as we keep having to find batteries with the last wisps of Eleth in them to even get the facility running enough to reach the repair machine to begin with, which eats a lot of time. But it does explain some things like Sophie's nanite regenerative form that healed the group at the beginning of the game, as well as once Sophie's actually in the regeneration pod, her memories are manifested visibly, allowing the game to contextualize the monster at the beginning of the game as Lambda for the party, so they're up to speed with the rest of us. But when Emeraude tries to reinforce Sophie's core program and mission to destroy Lambda at the cost of her memories, she ends up accidentally bringing up all the data files that expose her own malice and evil, which convinces them that they can bring the situation to a proper conclusion now that they have the right means and understanding to sympathize and come into dialogue with Lambda. This allows Sophie to reject her core program, which has been in conflict with her conscious self, and limiting her own powers for quite some time. The resolution of it bringing her back to full strength, and remotely transmitting a power boost to Aspel, Hubert, and Cheria as a result due to the remnant nanites still within them. Regardless of this, Emeraude wants Lambda dead, so she doesn't care as much about the means. So we end up on another errand to get additional military equipment we can attach to our shuttle that can pierce through Lambda's cocoon, which is once more just a maze-infested dungeon that stalls out progression to extend the game's length. But when we get there, Pascal uses the machine to give us our drill bit that can disrupt Eleth constructs. And even better, fashions 2 rings that give her and Malik the same abilities as the rest of them due to how the metal conducts ambient Eleth energy, even as Emeraude continues to try and gaslight the lot into outright killing Lambda, insisting she come along as well. With the upgrades to the shuttle, we easily pierce through the aquasphere and slam into the cocoon. And man, I am getting Halo 3 flashbacks from being in this environment. This really looks like that flood-infested ship you have to hunt through in that game. After a meandering trip through this cocoon, we find Richard and Lambda have entered into a dragonic balance breaker form. Don't ask, I don't even know. Lambda is as crazed as ever, but when we stop them, we succeed in separating the possessing spirit from the host, only for the nature of Emeraude's backstab to become known, in that Sophie's anti-Lambda drive is a self-destruct system that will cause nanites to disperse and eradicate Lambda on an atomic level. At least that's what I assume, as the spiritual energy that makes up Lambda has to have some form of tangible measure that would allow a self-destruct system to achieve the intended mutual annihilation. Why would have not triggered before to the point Sophie lost all memory of the function? Best guess there is Sophie existed long enough for her to conceptualize her own existence, and thus lost the ability to self-terminate due to valuing her own life. Just not to the point where she'd view her own life as more important than others. Thus her various self-sacrificial attitudes when it came to Lambda harming others. But yeah, Sophie doesn't get to trigger it due to Emeraude's other betrayal, seeing all the life in the cocoon brought from Lambda's power, if Lambda actually did absorb the Lastalia Resorts, as a way to restore life to Fodra, whose own Lastalia, as said, has gone dead. It's not, it's just stopped releasing Eleth to the rest of the planet. Well, like Emeraude would understand that. But there's really no point, as Fodra's already mostly dead. The human population left doing just fine in Euphemia, or at least will be once we properly fix the Valkanists and the rest of the problems Aston caused. But yeah, you know the Japanese trope of having to fight as the end boss either a god entity or some nutjob viewing themselves as a god? Yeah, with us knocking Lambda out of Richard, that now occurs as Emeraude uses her android body as a power sink to absorb Lambda into herself.
そしてその物語の主役はこの私です。同時に私は主役でありながら物語を紡ぐ神になるのです。ラムダもエフィネアもフォドラも全てが私の意のままに描かれる。
Ma'am, this is a house that is in walking distance from a Wendy's.
喜びなさい。お前を連れ帰ってあげますよ。お前の故郷であるフォドラに。さあ、私と共に行きましょう、ラムダ。貴様のごとき存在が。
Thank you! Someone agrees with me. And we haven't even gotten to the part of the game yet that exposes how much she personally screwed everyone over yet. And because of this, you don't really grasp on first pass what this is. Justice. Lambda destroying Emeraude's body and her consciousness with it is it obtaining closure on the monster in human form that killed the one man that showed it any form of kindness.
リチャード、おいでラムダ、僕のところへ。
Really, Richard? Really? And so, hours later, we're back right where we started. Lambda diving down to the Lastalia, and the only way to stop it is Sophie. Just now, with the context that to stop Lambda permanently is to let Sophie die.
ラムダを消さないと、消さないと。
ソフィー、お前は自分のやろうとしていることの意味が本当に分かっているのか？自分が消えてもラムダを倒す、それは死ぬってことなんだぞ。
それが私が作られた理由だから。
ラムダを倒すために死ぬことがお前がこの世に生まれた理由だっていうのか？
そんな悲しいこと言わないで。死ぬために生まれたなんて。悲しい。ソフィーは悲しくないの？そんな一方的に運命を決められて。嫌なことは嫌だって言ってもいいのよ。悲しい。その気持ちは私にはよくわからない。私は人間じゃない。ラムダを消し去るために生まれた存在。ラムダを消して私も消える。それが私の使命。
なんだよ。なんなんだよそれは。
他にラムダを消す方法はない。アスベルは分かってない。アスベルたちにはラムダは消せない。
分かってないのはお前だ、ソフィー。お前は自分が犠牲になればそれで全部が解決すると思ってるんだろう。そうじゃない。それじゃ解決になんて全然ならないんだよ。お前は何も分かってない。自分一人で何でも解決できると思っている人の話を聞かない頑固者だ。いいかソフィー、俺たちは絶対に諦めない。諦めないからな。
At this point, the world map opens up to us again. The shuttle now acting as the airship the early Final Fantasy-esque progression system the Tales games of this era featured, revisiting a lot of old locations, acting as a last lap for the group as they try and convey the meaning of grief onto Sophie, who was not built to understand the concept that had swallowed Richard and Lambda whole.
いなくなることは悲しいことな。
そうよ。だってそうなってしまったらもう会えないじゃない。話したり笑ったり、そういうことがもう二度と一緒にできなくなるんだもの。例えば、そうね。私たちがいなくなってしまったら、ソフィーはどう思う？
そういうことを考えると、なんだ胸のあたりが重くなるような、苦しくなるような感じ。
それが悲しいってことよ。ちゃんとは
みんなが消えるのは悲しい。
ソフィーが自分を犠牲にするって聞いたとき、私たちもそういう気持ちになったのよ。
アスベルも。
もちろん。というか、アスベルが一番悲しかったんじゃないかな。だからあんなに怒ったのよ。
来て、もっと知るべきことがソフィーにはたくさんあるんだ。だから自分だけ犠牲になってそれで終わりにしようなんて思うな。それにソフィーにもあるだろ。これからやりたいこととか知りたいこととかさ。
やりたいこと、知りたいこと。私、黒ソフィーが風花になるの見てみたい。
風花か。そういや、植える時にそんな話をしたっけな。どうだ？この世界にはまだソフィーが知らないことや経験していないことがあるだろ。なら死んじゃダメだ。きっといろいろな出来事がお前を待っている。これからなんだよ。お前も俺たちも。
よかった。アスベル怒ってると思ってた。
ああ、あれはだな。
悲しくても怒るってシェリアが言ってた。
まあそうなんだが。
怒ってなかったのならそれでいい。アスベルには笑っていてほしいの。これからもずっと。
俺もまだまだ修行が足りないな。さてと、そろそろ執務室に行かないとみんなが待ちくたびれるな。さあ行こうか、ソフィー。
So it's planning time. Them seeing Richard split from Lambda, confirming for them that he can be saved. It's just reasoning with Lambda that is the long shot. But Aspel refuses to let anyone die.
"そうだ。俺たちは必ず帰ってくるんだ。リチャードもソフィーも失わずに。
So it's time to list off a few extra things in the game if you do some other activities. For example, if you pet and give fish to every cat you find in the game, you can get teleported to... Cat's Corner. I don't even know. You can find a bunch of rare stuff here, but the largest part of this is access to the game's cutscene library. Not like we need that as much in the modern day, but with footage capture technology. And then there's the requisite beach episode. You thought I was kidding, didn't you? This is also the time to face all the super bosses of the game. Each of the Valkenists having a guardian dragon within them. Why did they not come out to protect them from having their power drained? Which you can fight and defeat. Strata also has a secret ruin you can open after getting an Amarstian key from Fodra, but I completely forget what the purpose is to get through here. There's also the Oswald family vault that you can clear out that has a lot of healing items useful for the final dive down in the game. You can also find on the map north of Fendel, Lambda's original crash site, as well as the somewhat functional remains of the original Realian body Lambda used as its own when in Cornell's care, which is more operating on the echo of Lambda's essence than anything, requiring us to put it to rest so its suffering may end. On the northernmost tip of Wundor, you can find the Turtles HQ, the Turtles being those traveling merchants I mentioned a while back in passing. But when here, this is where you find that other quest I pointed out about Aspel taking with him and selling to them the Wundor Royal Sword by accident, where you can recover it and see its condition to continue my recurring thesis on how just bad at everything Aston was. And I again say on the matter of so many things in this game, how was Aspel supposed to know when no one that did would tell him shit? Regardless, even once it's restored, it's still not that good a weapon as the one I won for the Colosseum ages ago. So it's not even really worth it beyond what's more acting as proof to what I've been saying. If you go to the Valkenist in Fendel, you can also find along the path to it a grave marker, one for Lorelia, the previous mentioned Chancellor's daughter that Malik loved, which helps act as closure for him, in his hope that whatever there is beyond death, that she's waiting for him when it's time. With all that done, we make for the core of the planet. The drop to the Lastalia locked off by a series of platform puzzles that, well, make more sense than the last few dungeons because it's supposed to be a secure area that is deliberately made to be tough to penetrate. The entire trip down punctuated by those scenes I've mentioned previously that all reveal Lambda's backstory and most of the evidence behind my case against Emeraude earlier, punctuated more critically from when it crossed from Fendel into Wundor and fought Sophie that led them going into stasis until the beginning of the game's events. And also the reason why I came to reside in Richard as I explained several videos ago. And so, we reach the Lastalia and Lambda's efforts to absorb it. And I cannot understand a thing anyone is saying. Why? Because it is white text on a bright freaking background. How many times do I have to complain about this? As I checked, and this is not a problem in the Japanese version with the kanji and the kana. When you put subtitled text in a video game, and it's not in its own blocked off text box, you need to make sure the font that is being put in the goddamn game has a solid black edge around it so it can be read. Like, I do internet videos, and every time I have a text blurb on screen, I do that. It's been especially important for me to do that since I swapped my IKEA bookshelves as the backdrop of my set back in 2021 due to how much more white there is now. But yeah, this conversation at last gets to the root of why Richard sided with Lambda. It made him believe that killing the planet is required to allow him to create the world of peace that he so desired. Only without allowing him to realize that he'd be killing everyone he wants to do it for alongside it. And on some level, Richard knew this. Knew that he was being lied to and dragged along and just couldn't stop himself in the vain hope that what Lambda was doing was the real deal. For after we defeat the Lambda-possessed Richard, Speaking of, I've not talked much about the boss encounters all freaking game, as it's basically the same gameplay every time as the base battles, with not that much variation. I like the combat system, but there's not a lot of strategy to the mechanics that makes boss fights any different from anything else, beyond the importance of what enemy is to the story. Anyways, Richard admits he was hoping Aspel would be the one to stop him, as that would signify more than anything else that his path was wrong, which he can't even tell anymore due to how much his and Lambda's thoughts have intermingled.
君と争いながらも君に助けてほしいと願うなんて。お前は俺の友達だ。どんなに争っても俺はお前を見捨てない。見捨てられるもんか。アスベル、君はこんな僕をまだ友と呼ぶのか。
Richard offers his life to kill Lambda, which gets right back to the point that was exposed by Cornell and Sophie, it not understanding the concept of self-sacrifice after all this time. It tried to kill Richard to separate itself from its host, Aspel dragging him to freedom at last, so they can finally confront Lambda's true form head-on.
その必要のないものまで争いに巻き込み、悪として滅ぼす。それがいかに無知でおごった考えか。分かろうともしない。死をもってその罪を償うがいい。
Which gets us back to the thesis I've been dancing around all game. That is what's seen of every goddamn person I've called out throughout it, and is sure as hell a more present theme in it than responsibility. And that is... your personal hardships do not give you the right to inflict suffering on others. Harming Lambda enough causes it to release all the Eleth absorbed from the Valkanists, returning it to the Lastalia, which over time will restore power to those devices. Without their power, Lambda will fall asleep again, only to threaten the world later, which Sophie will not allow, even if it means the cost will be herself.
やめろ、ソフィー。言っただろう。俺は絶対お前を消させないと。
I so very much prefer this character over Suzaku, if you could not tell before. So instead, Aspel absorbs Lambda into himself. For part of the problem from before is Lambda chose the wrong host. Not just my view that Hubert would have been better thematically for the story, but he chose one that only reinforces the worst experiences of existence to justify itself to lash out. Aspel, however, is different. As beyond the crap Lant shoved onto him, he is an optimist. His actions have made the world better, experienced the smiles of gratitude, and has always represented the best of what one could be to help hold up others. It is so diametrically in conflict with what Lambda has himself lived that it actually suppresses the malice it's been infected with, as that malice cannot take hold within Aspel. It's also my final showcase to why scapegoating Aspel throughout the game was so wrong of it, as it once again undermines this ending by making it so Aspel's just as experienced the worst of humanity in a broader sense than just the machinations of a malicious few, and should reinforce Lambda's position if he were possessed to corrupt his thoughts. If he's so valorous and acknowledged in story that the offenses against him are wrong, and are the consequences of other people not understanding the truth, which they then learn and apologize for to present their better angels, then it's a better presentation of the resilience of his spirit as they are exonerated. But as that doesn't happen, well, this don't work the way they want it to.
読めているか。だったらその読みはまだまだ甘いな。俺がいつ一人で乗り切れると言った。誰しも一人では乗り越えられないことがある。けど手を取り合い協力し合えば何だってやれる。俺はそう思っている。
協力？ その言葉で騙されるのは愚かな人間という存在だけだ。
だがお前は知っているはずだ。人間は決してそれだけじゃないと。誤解から悲劇が生まれ、その悲劇がさらに大きな悲劇を生んだ。お前がこの世に生まれてやりたかったことはそういう悲劇の連鎖なのか。お前を育てたコーネルさんは悲しませるためにお前を育てたんじゃないはずだ。生きるとは何かなんて俺には簡単に答えられない。だがこれだけはわかる。お前を育てたコーネルさんはお前にこの世界をもっと見せたかったんじゃないか。なあラムダ、この世界をもう一度見てみないか。俺の中に入ったまま一緒に生きることでだ。
これからはお前と我と二人だけの戦いになるということか。
ああ、そういうことだな。俺は望むところだ。
少し長く話しすぎたようだ。それとももう限界が近いのか。アスベル、我は少し眠らせてもらうぞ。
ラムダ。
And so Lambda goes to sleep inside Aspel, as he's finally dispelled of his malice. Aspel's experiences in the future coming to decide whether Lambda will continue to strike at humanity, or finally find a way to coexist peacefully with them. This is the original end of the base game. Scenes of Richard leading forces against the remnant monsters left behind by Lambda's cocoon to make up for his part in those sins, backed up by Cheria, who's continued to travel abroad to actually learn more of what the world has to offer than just the launch she had limited herself to. Pascal and Fourier get to work on fixing the Fendel Valkinus, with Pascal thinking, hey, if the heat and Thyrelith can't travel far from the Valkinus, they'll just construct a giant water boiler and pump hot water to everyone's homes! This is really stupid, and completely ignores how heat transfer works, where the cold environment of Fendel would completely sap all heat from those water lines so they'd freeze regardless. I actually have a water line in my home that I'm looking to get replaced because it freezes over, and it's a hot water pipe at that. So, case in point for how much this doesn't work. The water boiler idea is a good one, but the boiling water should be used to turn turbines. As you know what the turbines can then do? Create electrical energy. This is literally how all coal and nuclear power plants in the real world work. They boil water that turns a turbine. Hell, you can set up multiple of those boilers in series and parallel with each other to create an entire network of turbines to send electrical power to all of Fendel. And the electrical heaters would solve literally all heating problems, as electrical wires are a lot more efficient conductor and means of transferring energy, whereas water on its own is one of the worst. To not even get into the logistical problems that exist for even laying all that water piping, as opposed to just running electrical wires which take far less resources to even implement. And worse, electrical energy is already something showcased to have been harnessed in this setting for them to know about this, as presented by a lot of the installations in Windor for them to know how such works. These people are smarter than this, and I am baffled they did not think of it before. Malik is formally pardoned for his past actions, acting as an ambassador to the other nations thanks to the embargo against them having been lifted by Hubert and Aspel. And as for Aspel, well, with him having fixed everything his father screwed up and his actions having led to a renewed spirit of international cooperation, there's less need for a knight, thus has taken over learning how to do his job as a lord, while watching after Sophie. who's made it her own personal mission to spread renewed life to the world through the flowers she will plant, that all originated from a hill under a tree. But unfortunately, we are not quite done yet. As well, that closes out the core game. This is the PlayStation 3 port of what was originally a Nintendo Wii game. And as was common to the Tales releases of that era, they extended the story a bit further. So come back next time for Grace's bonus chapter, Lineage and Legacies.
必ず生き残る。さあ、砲翼砲。
強いね、アスベル。
そうでもないさ。
お前も一人前になったものだな。
そうでもないって。
ええ